Thank you, everybody, and thank you for the welcome. It's always interesting to be in university spaces. You know, I feel so old now. This for me was 10 years ago. So I hope you guys will excuse me if I feel a bit nervous standing on this side. I was also quite used to being on that side. Yeah, thank you very much for the welcome. As I said, my name is Big Daddy Liberty, and I am a talk show host on a newly formed online show called The Big Liberty Show. You can find that on YouTube, social media. As I see people sort of pulling phones out, yeah, you're more than welcome to subscribe to the channel. Essentially, what else I do is to be an advocate for liberty in a country which is slowly beginning to abandon its freedom mantra, its freedom outlook, and sort of slide back into what South Africa has always been, a state which is very much controlled in a centralized way and essentially by a small elite. That elite has always been there, it's just changed guard. We once had a colonial elite, which generally viewed itself as being superior to everybody else. Then we transitioned into an apartheid or an Afrikaner nationalist elite, which also saw itself as having its own people and being elite to other groupings. And of course, we now find ourselves in a new dispensation with a new elite who are quasi-socialist and pine for socialism, but really are at the helm of a crony state. So today's address will basically address partly that element of it, but also to have a broader discussion around the impacts of it on ordinary people like you and me, right? On how the ideas that are linked to identity are beginning to pervert society to an extent and corrupt the institutions that are meant to protect everybody through a prism of freedom or that are born out of freedom. So, that being said, thank you so much for having me. I am going to go into a speech mode, so if my voice becomes sort of monotonic from here on forth, please bear with me. So I am the head of strategic operations at the Institute of Race Relations, and who are we really? Well, we are a advocacy organization that fights for your right to make decisions about your life, your family, and your business, free from unnecessary government, political, and bureaucratic intervention. One of the things I often say is, it's been for far too long that South Africans have had to put up with governments and politicians who tell them not only what to do and how to live, but also who they are. We have and continue to endure a crooked coalition of different interest groups within politics, the state, and of course within some pockets of civil society, the media and academia, who drive ideas into society that seek to polarize and divide people. These divisions can be based on tribal, collectivist, and even nationalist ideas. So that the individual in South Africa, whether black or white, has always been under assault from one group of nationalists or collectivists, there you go, that little bit of youth came out there. But essentially, as I was saying, the individual in South Africa, whether they are black or white, has always been under assault from one group of nationalists or collectivists or identity merchants. Now, these are people who have taken pride in having a chosen grouping or an our people. And you hear politicians speak a lot about this, the idea of having my people or our people. These are people who they favor essentially over others. They do not view people as individuals. They hate the concept of the individual. To them, people are defined by their identity, that is, traits about you, such as your race, your gender, your ethnicity, or even your income levels, things that are actually really aesthetic and nothing about you on the inside. We see this type of thinking play out in our society daily, in our politics, our institutions of society, and of course in academic spaces such as this one. Different vested interest groupings who trade on identity and peddle dangerous ideas aimed at creating a toxic narrative of us and them. These are essentially people, who create this toxic narrative of an us and them. These identitarians, as I call them, are deeply immersed in the rhetoric of division. They find their intellectual roots in mostly postmodernist and leftist ideas, such as cultural Marxism, critical theory and its various iterations, and of course, intersectionality. These ideas are broadly born out of the failure of actual classical Marxism in the 20th century, where upon realizing how bloody the socialist and communist experiments of these ideologies were, academics and elites began to abandon this as an inadequate use, they abandoned these ideas as inadequate as a primary use of class analysis and preferred new means of analyzing society. So what did they do? They modified them. They modified the ideas of classical Marxism, and instead of a class struggle and describing groupings and divisions of society as being born out of different classes, in other words, the proletariat or the bourgeoisie, many of these postmodernist ideas transitioned and started viewing groups rather based on identity. That is your race, your gender, of course the tried and tested in terms of communists was also class, they retained class. But the primary means of viewing groupings now shifted to being that of identity. Thus, from this point, and invariably it happened, as it would, social theories then developed to support this shift in approach. The new focus still relied on making the classical Marxist argument of there being a relationship of exploitation and oppression of one over the other. Only this time, the primary focus wasn't on the bourgeoisie oppressing the working class, but rather on those group identities argued to hold power and privilege, oppressing and exploiting those that don't hold that same power or privilege. So, for example, and rather predictably, something like critical race theory identifies this relationship through a racial lens, through a racial prism. And of course, something like intersectionality creates a broader framework, providing for the supposed influence of other identity traits, such as gender, your income levels, and arguing that they somehow intersect in a way that influences or oppresses certain group identities. These race, gender, and identity-obsessed ideas have a real-world consequence. They don't just reside here on university spaces and intellectual jerk circles. They are primarily polarizing, and especially in this country, they primarily polarize society, and they focus on segmenting people into groups where one side is characterized as being problematic or oppressive, and juxtaposed, of course, against another group which is pathologized as being weak or victims. In South Africa, these identitarian ideas have worked to try and divide this country, where, for example, white South Africans, or specifically whiteness, we are told is an identity trait of oppression, how that is somehow white people are commonly maligned as being inherently racist, as being land thieves, and are seen as the source of all of South Africa's problems. So the identitarians would have us believe. On the other hand, identitarians will casually paint black South Africans as being weak victims, as somehow incapable of free thought, and nefariously in need of their control as the woke identitarians. There's always that element of black South Africans or the weak needing some grouping to control them. Now, the adherents to this way of thinking are trapped in identity politics and groupthink, where nobody is an individual to be judged on their merit. Instead, as I've pointed out, they'll argue that each of you are determined by a group or an identity, such as your race, your gender, your ethnicity, or your income level, or any other social identity that they determine. It's always them that do the determining of this. These dangerous and polarizing ideas are actually quite easy to rebuke and disprove through debate and a free exchange of ideas. However, ever increasingly, it has been the methods that are used by identitarians to actively prevent debate and the voicing of opposing views that has caught the attention of advocates for liberty, like me and many others. At this stage, I would invite you to do a cursory search on social media, and you'll find hours upon hours of footage and clips of the very same identitarians I speak of, who have garnered notoriety and a bit of a cult status for their methods of shutting down free speech and free thought. Now, I know a lot of you have access to the net here, lol. All of you have access to the net here. You click on YouTube and there's always some video compilation or some viral video that goes off of some random individual who believes in a certain identity or a certain group think, saying something which arguably at a rational level sounds absolutely absurd, and the video goes wildly viral, and then people sort of do compilation videos, and then it dies down. But there's always a new video coming out of the same modus operandi, and usually it's of them shutting down discussion, shutting down debate, and usually threatening other people who oppose their ideas and views. Their use of this mob behavior to intimidate and disrupt speakers that they disagree with, often violently suppressing opposing views that counter their bad ideas, is usually with intimidation and violence, whilst simultaneously and rather cunningly claiming to be the victims themselves to shield themselves from scrutiny. There are three defining features. There are three defining features of the methods that are used by those who oppose your freedoms, particularly free speech and free thought. There's three methods they use. One is victimhood, and I'll go into these, I'll unpack them. Number two is the idea of perpetual anger. And the third one is justified, in inverted commas, hate. Justified hate. Three methods used. Let me unpack them. And no, I will not say cheers like the politicians do in Parliament. By appropriating a victim status that paints any criticism or scrutiny of their motives as heresy, because after all, what monster would question a victim, they essentially shut down any rational attempt at honest dialogue and critical engagement. Then, of course, true to their critical theory underpinnings, they'll then justify taking on an angry disposition, because they're victims, right? They'll justify taking on an angry disposition, arguing that their anger is born out of their recognition, i.e. their wokeness, of their oppression and their oppressor, namely the people or structures that make them a victim. From there, having established their victim status and signaled their virtue as being woke, in other words, woke to or angry about their oppression and their oppressor, they'll excuse and justify their hatred and any behavior or policy decision that emanates from that. So that's how those three things are linked: the victimhood, the perpetual anger, and the justified hate. Let me just quickly gloss over it again. It's this idea that you establish a victimhood, that I am a black, disabled individual based on an identity. Remember, the victimhood status is always based on some sort of identity trait. It's never objective. It can also be quite subjective in terms of saying white female, white male, black female, etc. It's always based on identity. So they'll establish some victim narrative around that. And from that, a victim rightly, can also argue that, look, my position as being a victim makes me rather angry. Why? Because there's something, either structurally or a person who's making me a victim, an oppressor, if you will. So I'm rightfully, or I have a right rather, to be angry about that, perpetually angry if needs be. And of course, from the position of being perpetually angry, you can then justify hatred toward, or rather, you can justify having hatred towards that oppressor or that structure that oppresses you. And from that hatred, you are absolved from responsibility from the actions or the behavior that emanates from that, or even a policy, because now you find this sort of thinking in institutions. So that you can have an outwardly racist and hateful policy that is aimed at certain groupings who are argued to be the power brokers, and no one bats an eyelid. Which brings me to that next point, that this behavior, or this phenomenon rather, is not confined to university campuses. These methods and the bad ideas that come with it are now filtering into society through the graduates who've been essentially indoctrinated in these ideas. They are today your journalists, your elected public representatives, the policymakers in society, your HR department. That's a very favored part of the world that they find themselves in, these identitarians, your lawyers, your teachers, and many other professions. They are now, from a university space and into society, they are now corrupting the very institutions of state and society, which are actually meant to protect all South Africans regardless of your creed or race, whether you're black or white. It is through these methods and the violent prevention of open debate and free speech, that race merchants continue to divide South Africans using race, gender, and any other identity. Challenging their ideas is met with accusations of being either racist, or you're anti-revolutionary, a sellout, an Uncle Tom, a colonizer, and so on. I know most of you, depending on where you lie on the spectrum, have probably been called any of these words for simply questioning something someone else says to you. Every effort is made to prevent dialogue and debate, and instead to build mistrust, to sow division, and to maintain the different camps or campings based on nothing else but identity. However, it's important to keep a grip of reality, even being at a university campus like this, which is so insular and insulates you guys from the outside world. It's important to actually keep a strong grip on reality, the world out there, because it's different. The world spoken of by identitarians is largely false. It's a false one. South Africans are not buying into the rhetoric of identity politics that pit one group over another. And let me demonstrate my point. The Institute of Race Relations conducts some of the most extensive polling, national polling in this country. We are an institution that understands public sentiment. Our data is quoted by the media, it's quoted by wide circles, including research houses. And a recent poll that we ran pointed to the point I'm making now, which is when we asked respondents whether different class and race groups need one another, if we're to realize the country's potential, 3/4 of South Africans said yes. Different groupings, different races, different genders need each other if this country is actually to make it and to succeed, bursting this weird myth that somehow people are opposed to certain groupings having a contribution to this country. This 3/4 of people, this 3/4 of respondents, points to a South Africa which actually really has maybe a silent majority then. They are the millions of South Africans who don't form part of the elite chattering classes, and people really who simply just wake up every day to pursue opportunities and provide for themselves and their families. Generally, the people I speak of, the silent majority, are three things. They're God-fearing, they're law-abiding by and large, and they're family-orientated. They don't worry themselves about the fanciful postmodernist theories that come out of university spaces, and they really don't worry themselves about the racial and gender politics that is often pushed out as being somehow definitive of this country. These are people who wake up every day, seek opportunity in whatever form, no matter how meager, seek opportunity in order to provide something for their families. That is a general characteristic of a South African. As I said, these are people who simply just want to get on with it, and that's whether they're black or white. Now, going forward, if South Africa is to endure, indeed not just endure but prosper, then it's these people, the silent majority that I speak of, ordinary South Africans, rich and poor, black and white, who ought to be given the liberty, the power, and the resources, and not the politicians, and not the race mongers. Liberty, as is the name, liberty means giving individuals an opportunity to shape the course of their own lives, and to pursue their own self-interest. Doing this will require that we push back against the identitarian ideas to remind people that they own themselves and can define themselves free from the confines of the identitarian impositions on them, that actually they're free to work with anybody and cooperate freely with any other person or people that they see fit, and fight for good ideas, not identity, and definitely not for the merchants of identity. We're not here to fight for those individuals, nor their ideas. Fighting for good ideas is independent of your race, your gender, or your creed. Let me just share a few examples, because people often wonder, what are these ideas that I speak of? What are these liberty-leaning ideas that I preach on a daily basis? Look, I've been traveling around the country, sharing with people these very sort of ideas and asking them to stand for them, to place, these ideas that place power and authority back into the hands of individuals and families. For example, and I'll use three broad areas: safety, health, and education. What are the ideas that lean on the side of liberty? What are the ideas that devolve power into the hands of individuals and families? Well, on safety, to keep our families safe, whether you're in townships, suburbs, or rural areas, I argue and I advocate that communities must actually take charge of their neighborhoods, and the police must be professionalized, of course. Don't get me wrong, there is a legitimate role for police by the state. But right now, the police are in such a shambles that expecting them to be your primary provider of safety and security is a bit of it's a pipe dream. So I advocate, for instance, that security upgrades that your parents or you, if you have a home, make to your home. These are expenses that you incur that actually you should have a tax deductible that applies to them, because people are spending money to protect themselves of what should be the role of the state. The state is so enamored with ideas that are, anyway. People should have a tax deductible on these so that those individuals who take initiative to do something to protect themselves and their families have an incentive, a further incentive, because it is incentive enough to protect your life and liberty, but should have a further incentive through a tax deductible. A big one, which I presented at the ANC conference, at the ANC manifesto launch, if you watched the show on YouTube, because I've done all the three big parties. I was at their manifesto launch. I asked their members. I avoid the politicians. I speak to ordinary people. And one of the interventions along these lines that I propose is that communities must be allowed to elect their station commanders at the time of local government elections, or at the very least, that a CPF, a community policing forum, have greatly expanded powers to appoint a station commander. Far too often, when a major incident happens in a community, and I speak from experience here, we rock up in a community, a small sleepy town where something's happened like a rape. I'm suggesting that actually it should be communities that elect who that station commander is, someone who they trust, someone who they believe can organize a local police station, local policing resources to serve them. Another initiative that I speak to, again, the whole narrative, the idea, being that we devolve power and resources into the hands of individuals and families, is that we should be developing highly organized and well-resourced neighborhood watch schemes that are integrated with private security providers, particularly because they seem to be the most efficient, and their growth has shown that. For every one police officer you see, there's 5 private security officers in this country that outnumber police 5 to 1. It shows you that the private sector has actually organized themselves where there's been a state failure. The point I'm making here is that we should have a highly developed and organized and well-resourced neighborhood watch scheme that are integrated with private security providers and, of course, the police as soon as they get their act together. On health, you can do the same thing. It's possible to devolve power and resources and authority down to the level of the family, the individual. On health, in particular, I reject the ANC's notion, the idea they're punting, of a national health insurance. Now, when I say this, people go, well, how can you say that? It's universal healthcare. Well, actually, it's not. The NHI, or the National Health Insurance, would essentially be the ANC initiating a nationalization of healthcare and will impose nothing more than just heavier taxes on families without actually fixing the problem of healthcare provision in this country. Essentially, what the NHI would be, if I can make this example, is the creation of an ESCOM for healthcare. And we already know what happens when you create a monopoly over something, a service. Instead, I want to encourage families across the country, rich and poor, to lobby government to introduce healthcare vouchers to be allocated to poor households, allowing them to join a medical scheme of their choice or to buy their own health insurance completely. Government can increase the supply of healthcare facilities by privatizing state facilities, and then, of course, reform our laws to allow the private sector to establish more day hospitals and the like. This would also further the privatization and, of course, the relaxing of regulation. Should also be to allow for private universities and hospitals to train the doctors and the specialists and the healthcare providers that we need. It is absolutely untenable that in 25 years of democracy, we still, by and large, don't have extra or more capacity to train healthcare professionals, even though we sorely need these skills. And I'll make a random anecdote at this point. When we had Fees Must Fall, and the associated narratives around that movement, very little of it was speaking to actually expanding access to opportunities of education. We sort of made this faux link that if we made education free in an existing infrastructure, that more students would get education. That's not true. Universities are already bursting at the seams as we speak when it comes to capacity. We should be building more institutions, creating more opportunities via the private sector to train more young people. But essentially, we haven't created extra capacity, and this part of the debate was completely missed at such a crucial time as Fees Must Fall. Look, ladies and gentlemen, as I move on to the last area where I'm trying to make the case for liberty, when you speak about liberty and these sort of services, devolving them out of the hands of centralized authority, out of the hands of politicians, and into the hands of families, into the hands of individuals, the most important area that I often speak about, and I often spend time at length going through this is on education. Education is the single most effective tool of empowering any grouping in this country, specifically those who are currently disadvantaged. A good education that prepares a young person for the world of work, business, or entrepreneurship is the actual real form of economic empowerment that is needed in South Africa. I believe we can win people on the idea of allowing communities and parents to wrestle back the control of their schools, their local schools, from politicians and the various vested interest groupings like unions. And much like the health voucher that I spoke of earlier on, you can create an education voucher. Last year, the South African government spent 369 billion rand on education. That is the single largest expenditure outside of the military. Yet, I don't think anybody in this room can argue that the outcomes or what we're supposed to receive as value for that money has been necessarily good. It hasn't, and the data shows this. So clearly, radical reform is required in addressing this issue. And radical reform doesn't mean giving more control to politicians and officials in Pretoria. It means actually devolving that control, that power, into the hands of communities and families so that they are the decision makers. How do you do that? Well, like the health voucher I spoke of, you can break that 369 billion rand into education vouchers. Can you imagine? And our analysts at the Institute have done this calculation. You could give each family per child a voucher of between 16 and 20,000 rand for a parent to decide as to where they dispense that money. Suddenly you'd have parents avoiding the bad schools very quickly. Why? They have a choice. The freedom to choose is the single most empowering thing you can give a poor person. The idea that I can choose where I get a service. And if I don't like what you're providing, again, I can walk away. A voucher does that. Sorry, that was a bit of a passionate one because I really, really believe in this one. As I said, you can give parents a voucher of between 16 and 20,000 rand for them to decide where they take their children to schools. And the state, of course, can support that sort of behavior by selling government schools for as little as 1 rand to a private sector company, an NGO, or religious institutions for them to run the management of those schools. So you can suddenly have, thinking of Cape Town schools here, good ones, you can have SACS, Khayelitsha, where SACS says, look, we'll buy a few schools in Khayelitsha, we'll buy a few schools in Yanga, we'll bring the expertise, we'll bring the management, we'll pay better salaries. And they do this because they know that the parents in that community have the means to be able to provide, or buy that education. You mean to tell me there wouldn't be a springing of quality schools to meet that sort of demand? I bet half the people in this room would start a school to be able to meet that sort of demand. And a specialized school, if you believe that you should be starting a science, technology, engineering, or math type school, you start one, you provide it, you test the market, you allow parents to come there. If you believe there should be arts and culture schools, you do that. Why? You're able to do it because the market, you've created the market of parents wanting the best for their children. Right now, that market doesn't exist. If I live in Mlazi, where I'm from, and with the current policy of feeder schools, right, the idea that I need to find a school within the 5-kilometer radius of where I live, that's it. Those are my options. If those schools have a principal and teachers who don't really care, who just will get their salary anyway, regardless of the outcomes, what do you think I, as a poor person, can do about that? Very little. Very little. And here's where it gets even worse, and where it becomes cynical. Those same teachers, those same principals, ask the question of where they send their kids to school. Do they send their kids to those same schools? These are real-world implications for how ideas can impact society. When you have bad ideas, ideas that are formed around centralized control, that are formed around identity, then you'll have bad policy outcomes and they'll be justified. ANC policy in this country, which is based on identity by and large, to this day is still justified, even though the outcomes are poor. Worse yet, the outcomes are poor for the very same people who they claim to trade for, mostly Black South Africans and Africans in particular. So at what point do you begin to question identity-based ideas and ask for real radical change, if you will, that actually a real radical idea is to place power into the hands of individuals and families? Why shouldn't poor people and working class people enjoy the same sort of quality that you and I enjoy the benefits of because we're able to access a private sector, whether it's private health or private schools? Why shouldn't the poor people enjoy the same quality as that? Why should we sort of pacify ourselves and say, or at least the state is providing something for them? That's not good enough. It's absolutely not good enough. And it should be you in this room who agitate to make that point that actually it's not good enough. Why should poor people be subject to the dictates of identitarians, whether they're policymakers or politicians? And to this end, I believe that true liberty will mean putting the power and resources into the hands of ordinary families in this country, black and white across the country. These ideas, the ones I've just shared with you, are born out of the tried and tested classically liberal tradition. They seek, as I've made the point over and over, to devolve power away from centralized hands and elites and place it into the hands of individuals and families. It is these ideas that the identitarians fear. And it is why I fight every day to reach as many South Africans as I possibly can for them to hear these ideas, regardless of the climate of fear and intimidation and no-go zones that I've been told I can't go into, and I do go into. This is the battle between good ideas and bad ideas, and it's why I'm in this fight. But by and large, I can't do it alone. I do need your help, even those of you in this room. And some of the ways you can help Big Daddy Liberty is, on the one hand, you can support it financially, because I'm dependent on people like you. I speak to ordinary people and say, if you like these ideas and you believe that these ideas should be filtering into every part of this country, then join our crowdfunding campaign as the IRR. We have a crowdfunding campaign called the Friends of the IRR. On average, people give around between 70 and 90 Rand a month. We're not asking you to sort of empty your bank account. Actually, oh my goodness, I just remembered my student days. Maybe I shouldn't have said that too quickly. Yeah, you know, the average is about 70 and 90 Rand. These are people who believe that these ideas can transform the country, and they believe that people like me, and I'm not the only one, there's plenty of liberty advocates out there, should have an opportunity to reach as many people as possible, from the Limpopo to the Cape, to speak to ordinary people and say, don't believe the identitarians, don't believe the politicians. Here are ideas, stand for that, fight for that. Don't fight for this grouping or that grouping, stand for an idea, better the country, build something, be a part of something. And on that basis, the other way you can support me, and I really encourage this, is please subscribe to the show, watch the content, because it's not just me waxing lyrical every day, it's also me speaking to ordinary South Africans like you, and watch how people respond when you give them a different way of thinking and you share ideas with them, which by and large, usually, they're prevented from hearing by certain groupings. And on that basis, I thank every single one of you for listening, and please do watch The Big Liberty Show.